All right, let's begin. Good afternoon and welcome to Virtual Face-to-Face with President Bruce Jarrell. I'm Alex Lakowski, Executive Director of Media Relations. What an amazing rush it would be to hear those three little words. No, not those three little words. Save that for Valentine's Day. No, this time it's emergency use authorization. That's a tool the FDA uses to make it easier for medical countermeasures, in this case, vaccines to protect against COVID-19, to get to people who need them during a health emergency, even before the agency has completed its normal and usually very lengthy approval process. It's not a step that's taken lightly. If any serious issues arise concerning the safety or efficacy of a vaccine after it receives EUA, it could be a terrible blow to confidence in our health system and acceptance of any future vaccines. Fortunately, the news so far is very good. On Tuesday, the FDA released staff findings ahead of an advisory committee meeting that's taking place right now. Now, that meeting is expected to lead to EUA approval for one of the leading vaccine candidates, the two-stage candidate developed by Pfizer and BioNTech. Developed, I should note, with a little help from our own Center for Vaccine Development and Global Health. A little bit more on that later. The FDA's analysis says efficacy in preventing confirmed COVID-19 occurring at least 7 days after the second dose of vaccine was 95%. They also noted generally mild to moderate side effects among many trial participants, but, quote, no specific safety concerns identified that would preclude issuance of an EUA. A second very promising vaccine candidate developed by Moderna, also with the help from CVD and Dr. Jarrell, actually, will get its hearing on EUA approval next Thursday. In all, 14 vaccine candidates around the world have reached stage 3 testing. Now, although Pfizer started shipping the vaccine from its plant in Belgium to the U.S. at the beginning of November, the U.K. actually cleared the vaccine for the first use and began administering it on Tuesday. The first to get the shot was 90-year-old Margaret Kennan. Right behind her, if you can believe it, 81-year-old William Shakespeare. I am not making that up. Initial giddiness over the vaccine there has, however, subsided a bit after 2 recipients suffered anaphylaxis and another had a possible allergic reaction. Pfizer has now advised that people who've suffered severe allergic reactions in the past should not be given their vaccine. Canada also got the drop in the U.S. yesterday, approving the Pfizer vaccine for use in its national health system. But here in America, states, they're ready to move quickly. Maryland expects to have the first batch of about 155,000 doses by next week. They'll go to hospital workers and nursing home residents. The federal government says if both the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines get EUA, there should be enough doses in the U.S. for about 20 million people roughly by the end of the year. Now, that is certainly a good thing since the pandemic continues to rage, especially here in the U.S., where the number of new COVID cases now averages more than 200,000 each day. And we haven't really seen yet the impact of holiday travel and gatherings, so that's not predicted to come down anytime soon. Joining Dr. Jarrell today to sort out what's going on with SARS-CoV-2 vaccines and to answer your questions is our own Dr. Kathleen Neuzil. She's the Myron M. Levine Professor in Vaccinology and Director of the Center for Vaccine Development and Global Health. And I should also note that she serves on the World Health Organization's Strategic Advisory Group of Experts, or SAGE group, on immunization. Welcome, Dr. Neuzil.
Thank you.
I need to quickly tell you that this program is being recorded and will be posted on the UMB homepage, umaryland.edu. A little later in the program, you'll have a chance to ask your questions. Don't wait. Get them ready now. Find the chat button at the bottom of your screen, select Chat with Host, and send me your question. I'll let you know when we're going to come to you. And I'll even turn your mic on for you, so all you have to do is listen for your name and speak up. Now, with all that out of the way, here's our host, UMB President, Dr. Bruce Jarrell.
Greetings all, and Alex, thank you for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, and especially a pleasure to have Dr. Neuzil here as our expert today. Kathy, thank you for being here.
You're welcome.
I wanted to start off with 2 personal notes. First of all, how many Zoom sessions do you have a day, and how many interviews do you have with news agencies and groups like that? It must be a whirlwind for you.
You know, we are very fortunate at CVD to have such a breadth of experts, so I get to share the wealth with all of them. But honestly, we have probably had 8 to 10 regular faculty step forward here. You know, we take it as a very serious part of our jobs to educate the community, to get the right messages out through the media. But to answer your question, it's a lot. I mean, there are times I'm giving 2 talks a day. You know, we haven't had a week or even a day go by recently where there hasn't been major news on the vaccine. So again, it's a big commitment, but one that's really important if people are going to be able to trust these vaccines.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that, and I thank you for being here. Now, for the audience, I also want them to know that you just got pulled away from that FDA hearing of listening to it. What are you hearing in that hearing, and what's your prediction there about how that's going to come out?
I think it's going well so far. You know, to me, the driving factor is we're in a pandemic. There's been massive health and economic devastation. You know, we're seeing 3,000 deaths a day in the United States. I think if it weren't for the fact of this horrible morbidity and mortality, we would be jumping for joy about these vaccines. But it's actually a very conflicted position. And we know that every day that goes by, 3,000 people are dying unnecessarily. And so it's a position, it's a meeting today that's being taken very seriously. You know, many people and many layers of review have looked at these data. Many people on this call have seen the news and that these are highly efficacious vaccines. Some of them have taken the time, some of you have taken the time to look at the scientific data. So again, on the vaccine side, we have highly effective vaccines, and really we need them now.
Yeah, I have to admit, this morning in one of our management calls, we were talking about the state of Maryland and its data, and it was a very sad moment for me. I looked at 49 Marylanders died in the past 24 hours of this disease, and you just look at that impact, and it's huge, and it's so easy to forget that in the scientific turmoil of everything that's going on, turmoil in a good way, and yet there are people who are still dying every day. And I don't mean just the old or the infirm or those with diseases. I mean young people, all kinds of people. So it's just a very serious time. And yet these vaccines were turned out in record time. Is it just that we're in a pandemic and it was an emergency, or has our technology advanced so much to make us so much better at this?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think there are a number of reasons. Certainly, this being a pandemic drove the resources, and you know, our government from the beginning resources, and that resource allocation made a huge difference. It made a huge difference from us being able to do many activities that we would do in a staged form to do them in parallel. You know, it allowed us to do trials of 30,000 people rather than 10,000 people and get those trials and get to endpoints 3 times sooner. The other critical aspect is the science and the scientific advances. You know, it's really amazing science, and you know, Barney Graham at the Vaccine Research Center at NIH, who actually trained me at Vanderbilt and was one of our Frontier speakers, and Kasmekia Corbett, who was this year's Frontier speaker, have been working on these optimized antigens for years, and this pre-fusion stabilization and a way to very quickly with a new virus be able to get a genetic sequence of what is a good antigen. And so their prior work on the first SARS virus and the MERS virus really allowed them to move very quickly. And again, just underscores the great need for basic science, you know, for funding of basic science and advances in basic science.
Now, you mentioned a name, the Frontiers in Science speaker, Dr. Kasmekia Corbett, who has a special connection here and was our speaker. I noticed that Dr. Fauci just introduced her to a group yesterday publicly. You want to tell the audience a little bit about her?
Yeah, she's just fantastic. She's a PhD scientist and virologist. She actually did her undergrad work at UMBC. And again, I'm not sitting with my her CV in front of me, but I believe she was a Meyerhoff scholar and really mentored by Dr. Hrablowski himself. And she really comes from very humble backgrounds. You know, she's an African American from a small rural town in North Carolina who just really became passionate about science at a young age and was fortunately given mentorship and opportunities to be able to reach her goals.
Yeah, so it's a great feather. Certainly in Maryland's cap, and it's wonderful to have a prominent African-American scientist involved in this development. So we should take a lot of pride in that. So one of the things, so I was in the Moderna trial, as you know. I don't know which side of the trial I was stuck with in my arm. One of the questions that comes up is that, of course, in the usual vaccine trials from the past, you had many years of safety data, and you know that these obscure diseases or other problems really didn't happen very often. Now here we are at 40,000 or 30,000 in the Moderna trial. So how comfortable, how safe should we feel that size trial? Should it give us comfort or doesn't it give us comfort?
Yeah, I think it certainly gives me comfort. We always have to understand that safety isn't an absolute, and we can show that any adverse event may be less than a 1 in 30,000, less than a 1 in 100,000, and that as we introduce this to broader populations, perhaps as we saw in the UK, you know, you may get side effects that you don't see until you introduce vaccines to millions or hundreds of millions. And one aspect that gives me confidence is that, again, the safety assessment and the safety follow-up doesn't stop with the EUA. It doesn't stop with licensure. We have robust systems in the United States for all vaccines that we use for the duration of the lifetime that we use them. I will also say that most vaccine side effects occur soon after the vaccine is given. So allergic reactions generally very soon after a vaccine is given, within hours. It may be delayed sometimes, but certainly early on, you know, in the first few days. Rarely we'll see side effects, some of these immunologic side effects, Guillain-Barré syndrome with influenza vaccine, which occurred at an excess rate of about 1 per million. So our safety follow-up in the US can pick up rare events, even excess events of 1 per million. So again, that gives me confidence. And that occurred at about 6 weeks following vaccination there. So, you know, with 30,000 plus people in the trial, actually there were more than 40,000 in the Pfizer trial, right, and a 2-month duration, that's a median duration of follow-up, that gets us beyond that usual time point when we see vaccine side effects. And again, if we look at typical trials that include 10,000 people, then we have many more than that already. Again, this is not to say it's a risk-benefit ratio. You know, even if we do have an adverse event that occurs in 1 per million, we have 3,000 people a day dying. So we have to put those in context of the severity of the disease we're trying to prevent.
So really, the way you're viewing it is the safety data, although it's not over years, the quantity of it and the safety of these is really quite high, and you have high confidence in them.
I have high confidence in the safety data. It is absolutely legitimate that people are saying it's short-term safety data. Again, I mean, another example would be intussusception seen after a rotavirus vaccine, you know, 30 years ago. That occurred in the first week after the vaccine was given. So I think the vast majority of side effects are going to occur very early on. We've had a lot of people followed very early on, and the CDC and the FDA are setting up a number of systems. And in the same way, I think most people know, you've mentioned it, that Maryland has a vaccine and treatment evaluation unit here, which are expert NIH network of sites who do clinical trials. The NIH, the CDC, FDA have a network of sites across the country who are expert at doing vaccine safety surveillance. So they will all be putting their efforts towards this vaccine.
I think Dr. Levine and Dr. Kotloff had that grant for well over 20 years, wasn't it?
The VTU grant, or
even longer?
It's been closer to 40 years. So yeah, so they've been involved here in the development and licensure and policy pathway for many, many vaccines. And Dr. Kotloff and her team, I doubt any of them are on here because they're very, very busy preparing for their next large trial of the Novavax vaccine. And again, have just made enormous contributions to these current COVID-19 vaccine efforts.
Yeah, well, one of the reasons I enter clinical trials is to experience firsthand how well the system works with CVD. And I have to tell you, you have an exemplary unit. It's a pleasure to be there and see the competence there. So my hat's off to you on that one. Well, one other question, and I want to remind the audience to make sure to put questions in because we have Dr. Neuzil until 3 o'clock. So get your questions in. One of the questions here is about children and whether they're, one, infectious, I suspect they are, and two, where they stand relative to the vaccine. Any insights there?
Yeah, it's a great question. Children appear to have been less affected than adults by COVID-19. That being said, 164 children have died of COVID this year. That's likely an underestimate. Those are the reported deaths. And so, it puts COVID number one at the top of the list of COVID vaccine preventable diseases in children. We also know, similar to the adult population, that the COVID burden in the pediatric populations falls disproportionately on the minorities and the economically disadvantaged communities. So, here at CVD, Dr. Jim Campbell, who's very active with the American Academy of Pediatrics, Dr. Karen Kotloff, our other pediatricians, me, have really, really pushed that we not forget children. They can't advocate for themselves, and we need to advocate for them. And we are in very active planning to move into children with clinical trials of these vaccines. The Pfizer has already moved into testing down to 12 years of age, but we will be in a very careful manner moving down in age. I mean, we would love to have a vaccine that we could give to children next summer that would definitively allow everybody to safely go back to school.
Right. So reminding the audience, make sure you're writing your questions. So a question that I get asked a lot is, if I'm vaccinated, I'm presumably protected against the COVID infection myself. Am I still able to transmit COVID infection to individuals who have not been vaccinated? Am I still able to carry the virus and sneeze it or cough it out?
Yeah, that's a great question and a really important question that we don't entirely understand. One reason that this virus has been able to take off in a way that no other virus in our lifetime has been able to do is because it does transmit very easily. And it transmits when people are asymptomatic. So people are feeling fine and they're out in society, and yet they're still shedding virus. So the jury is still out. We maybe have a hint from some data in the UK that vaccines may reduce viral shedding. It's certainly not definitive, and the safe assumption at this point is that it is unknown. And so people need to continue, whether you've had COVID or whether you've had a vaccine for COVID, you need to continue to wear your mask. You need to continue to social distance. Now, once we have enough supply and almost everybody has been vaccinated, or a large proportion of the population has been vaccinated, then we can start to relax these restrictions. Even if I'm shedding a little bit of virus, if with a 95% effective vaccine, if 19 of 20 people I come in contact with can't catch that virus because they're immune to it, then the virus is going to be stopped dead in its tracks because of the high efficacy vaccine and people taking the vaccine.
Right.
But we're not there yet.
It'll be a nice day when we get there, though, won't it?
It'll be a nice day when we get there.
Gotcha. So Alex says we got a whole lot of questions. So Alex, fire away.
We do have a lot of questions, and most of them seem to be about safety. As you might imagine, that is the thing, and that is what's holding some people back in that recent study that said, half the population is ready to go, but about a quarter are like, well, I got to wait and see. Not Lynn asks about people with autoimmune conditions. Are they okay to take a vaccine, a new vaccine?
Yeah, it's a really good question. One point I should make that we haven't mentioned yet is that, even people who don't die from COVID, there are some long-term risks that are at present poorly understood. And it's one of the challenges at looking at these particular subpopulations or some of the questions about long-term safety, because we just don't know enough about the disease, right? To know the long-term consequences of the disease, let alone, any potential consequences of a vaccine. Most of the clinical trials, while they had quite liberal inclusion criteria, which means, most people, we didn't exclude people with chronic diseases. We didn't exclude people with stable HIV infection. There really aren't enough people in every subcategory to be able to give a definitive answer for those subcategories. We're likely to end up in a position after the EUA, if that should occur based on the hearing today, and then after the advisory groups with perhaps a shared decision-making situation. There's nothing about the mRNA vaccines that should make them unsafe for autoimmunity. We're just taking the genetic sequence of the virus, we're delivering it to the immune system, and we're making that spike protein. So there's nothing intrinsically different. I should also mention that these mRNA vaccines are intrinsically unstable and degrade pretty quickly, which is exactly why we have to put these vaccines in a freezer. So there isn't a lot of concern. It's not DNA where it might be integrated into the nucleus and last for a very long time. There's not a lot of concern that this will hang around in our body and trigger on autoimmunity. But it's most fair for me to say that we simply don't have the answers yet in some of these less common populations and less common risk groups.
Great. Alex?
Well, our Facebook feed reaches all over the place, and we got a question. This is another anonymous question from a viewer in Cumberland who writes, and I don't know, I can't verify this, but writes that the UPMC, which is the hospital in Cumberland, announced today they're going to conduct their own research of the vaccines before making it mandatory for employees. And the viewer wants to know, is that typical or is that unusual for hospitals or medical systems to make? A lot of people in other lines of work too are concerned that, will I have to take the vaccine?
Yeah, so the word mandatory shouldn't even be in our vocabulary yet for this vaccine. This will be a vaccine under EUA. And in fact, we can't make this vaccine mandatory for employment or school or anything else. So I'm hoping that was just an imprecise use of language there. People will be given the opportunity to receive the vaccine. Now, again, I've been involved in these efforts, these Operation Warp Speed efforts from the very beginning, from last January. All of these trials had an independent data and safety monitoring board, which means groups of experts that have looked at these safety data who aren't affiliated with the sponsors, with the manufacturers of the vaccine. It's going through a thorough FDA review. It's going through a thorough CDC review. So certainly any hospital has the right to conduct their own review. It's hard for me to imagine that could go beyond the extensive review that's already been conducted by the DSMB, the FDA, the CDC, and independent advisory committees.
Yeah, and from a UMB point of view, of course, we're a state entity. We will get very explicit advice from the Attorney General about how we will manage this. And so for the time being, there will be no mandatory decision on UMB until we get such advice.
Yeah, and I should say that CVD and School of Medicine faculty have been advising the governor in a number of areas, and including having positions on the committee that's advising our governor on use of this vaccine.
Yeah, very much. A lot of University of Maryland, Baltimore, the School of Medicine, and UMMS involvement in all of those activities. Alex?
All right, you read about a lot of all these different vaccine candidates, and they have different ways of operating. Everly Brown has a question about this one. Everly, are you there?
Hi, Alex. Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Hi, Dr. Jarrell and Dr. Neuzil. I've heard that you need to get 2 injections for this vaccine. If that's true, what's the time period between vaccinations? Also, if you've already had COVID, do you need to get the vaccinations?
Yeah, so really good questions. In terms of the number of vaccinations needed, both the Pfizer and the Moderna, which are likely to be the first 2 vaccines available, are mRNA vaccines and require 2 doses. Pfizer chose to go with a 3-week interval between. Moderna went with a 4-week interval. It probably doesn't matter much, and we'll see what guidance the CDC gives us. I think one of the most positive pieces of data that I've seen with the full public release of the Pfizer data is how quickly, however, these vaccines become effective. Within 2 weeks of getting that first vaccine, we already start to see dramatic differences in the vaccine and the placebo group, with the vaccines being protective. That being said, the second dose, likely gets you up to 95% and will likely increase that durability. So 2 doses are needed. The only vaccine right now being tested in the US as a single dose vaccine is the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which has also already enrolled about 40,000 people, and we may soon be seeing results. And when I say soon, I mean in coming weeks. We may be seeing results of a 3rd or 4th vaccine candidate in the US. And that is a single dose vaccine. So it will be very interesting to see the efficacy of that single dose vaccine being tested here in the United States.
Great. You've got a lot of vaccine candidates that you test. Patricia Fanning, I'm going to try to bring you in. Let's see if your mic can work, and ask your question about another candidate. Go ahead, Patricia. Well, I tried. She's asking about the Novavax vaccine, that trial. What do you know about that? That's another Maryland-based, actually, company.
Yes, I was going to say Maryland's footprint is just AstraZeneca, Novavax. Of course, I already mentioned NIH's role here, and so Novavax is a type of vaccine that we have a lot more experience with. It's called a recombinant protein vaccine, and it's the recombinant S protein. So the S protein is that protein on the outer surface of the cell that initially binds to our receptors, and that's the way the virus gets into our body and causes all the trouble that it's causing. So rather than the mRNA vaccines, in which we give the genetic code and we make that S protein, with the Novavax vaccine, we simply give that S protein, and we give it with something called an adjuvant, which is a non-specific immune system stimulator. And for example, influenza vaccines, certain influenza vaccines are recombinant protein vaccines. The hepatitis B vaccine is a recombinant protein vaccine. So the University of Maryland CBD will be testing the Novavax vaccine. The trial has not started yet. The advantages of these protein vaccines is that, again, it's a tried and true methodology. This vaccine looked exceptional in phase 1 trials, really gives a great immune response, may not have quite as many side effects as the mRNA vaccine, but it's a lot more difficult to manufacture, which is why once you know how to do it and you get that process down, you can make oodles of it. But getting that process down takes time. And that's why we're just seeing the protein vaccines here in December going into these large phase 3 trials, whereas the RNA vaccines went into those trials in the spring. So we have high hopes for the Novavax vaccine, and we are very honored that we'll be testing it here.
You know, those of us who are not virologists and just read about these things in the papers, we always read that viruses mutate. And so Ed Heiger is here with a question that probably some people are thinking about. Ed, go ahead and ask your question.
Are we confident the vaccine will handle all variants of COVID-19?
Yeah, so really good question. And I might also mention somebody else here that's been integral to this process, and that's Matt, who's a faculty member in microbiology and immunology. And Matt was very instrumental, for example, in testing the Novavax vaccine in his mouse model and doing some of the original assays, not only for that vaccine, but for other vaccines. So why do I bring up Matt and other virologists? So, we do worry about what we call escape, and really the best in the business at this is the influenza virus, which changes constantly and may change dramatically. And it doesn't appear, coronavirus is certainly not in the same class as influenza, which is a good thing. We know we have to have a new influenza vaccine every year. We know sometimes in the course of the year, the influenza virus changes so much that the vaccine is suboptimal. Coronaviruses, again, they're RNA viruses. They do make replication mistakes and they do have changes, but nowhere near the degree of influenza. We're also seeing that what we call these neutralizing antibodies, so the antibodies that stop the virus from growing and spreading, those neutralizing antibodies appear to be very broad. So at least thus far, even viruses that have slightly changed are still able to be neutralized by the vaccine antibody. So that's really good news. And one reason is because we're using that S protein, we're using the full length. So it's not as if you're getting one type of antibody. You're likely getting a mix of antibody that all contribute to working against that virus.
All right, we just got so many questions. We might have you here for 6 hours. I hope you have time for that.
No.
I'm not going to use the name of this next caller. This is a little bit. This is something about the type of vaccine that you've worked on here. This mRNA vaccine. Go ahead, caller. I'm going to unmute your mic. You can ask your question. Oh, she's not there. Go ahead, ask your question. All right, I'll have to mute her. Anyway, she asks, is it true that mRNA has not been used in vaccines before? Is it used in cancer treatments? What are the side effects when used with cancer treatment? And how will this new type of vaccine impact long-term side effects?
Yeah, so good questions about the mRNA vaccine. It is true that we have never had a licensed mRNA vaccine before. So we've never had a vaccine make it all the way through this FDA approval process. But in fact, that has nothing to do with science and has nothing to do with side effects. That's really because of the market and a business reason. So let me give you some examples. Moderna, who makes one of these mRNA vaccines, was able to make it so quickly because they've made an mRNA vaccine for influenza. They've tested it. They have optimized the manufacture of it, and they've shown that it's immunogenic. It makes an immune response. But we already have 10 formulations of influenza vaccine on the market. So for a small company like Moderna to invest in bringing an mRNA vaccine all the way to a market for which nobody may buy the vaccine or it may be tough to compete, just wasn't a smart business choice. And similarly, we've seen mRNA vaccines for Zika when the epidemic waned quickly. And so for business reasons, not scientific reasons or safety concerns, these vaccines have never made it all the way to market. So here is the perfect business case for an mRNA vaccine. Again, we're in a pandemic. We have 3,000 people a day dying, and we have a vaccine that can be made quickly. I've reviewed some of the side effects of these vaccines. They're what we call reactogenic, which is the name for the really short-term side effects we see with vaccines. So, 70 or 80% of people will get a sore arm with these vaccines. Maybe a third of people will get some chills, and less than 10% of people may even get a little fever after the second dose of vaccine. These are short-lived. They don't last longer than a day or two in the vast majority of cases. So we call these vaccines reactogenic, but that doesn't mean that they're unsafe. These aren't any long-term problems. Again, they're self-limited problems. For those of you who have had it, these vaccines will hurt more than an influenza vaccine, for example. The way they might make you feel might be more similar to a zoster vaccine, for those of you who have had that, or an HPV vaccine, which are just slightly more reactogenic vaccines. And also, I might add, incredibly efficacious vaccines. So we hope that this reactogenicity reflects that the immune system is very much being stimulated to fight off COVID with these vaccines.
All right, we have a lot of questions about how this is going to play out in combating the pandemic and tamping it down. I have Chiradeep Mukherjee. You want to ask the first question on that line?
Sure.
Go ahead, you're on.
Yeah. My question is, so if someone takes a vaccine and they get COVID, for example, after the vaccine, so is there data today that you've reviewed to show how badly does this virus impact such people who have actually taken the vaccine and they've got COVID after that?
Yes, but fortunately, because the vaccine is so good, not many people. So, when you have a 95% efficacious vaccine, what we call our breakthrough cases, about 180 of those cases are in the placebo group and only 9 or 10 are in the vaccine group. So we only know about 9 or 10 people. What we do know is that none of the people who received the vaccine had severe disease in the Moderna trial. So 100% of people with severe disease are in the placebo group in the Moderna trial. Only one severe case in the vaccine group in the Pfizer trial, all of the rest in the placebo group. So there is no evidence of any vaccine enhanced illness. There's no evidence that anything about the vaccine makes the disease worse if you're exposed to the virus. Quite the contrary, 19 out of every 20 people who get this vaccine don't get COVID. And the rare exception, which occurred very early on, I might say, after receiving vaccine, don't get severe disease. The only death in the trial occurred in the placebo group.
All right, some of the other questions we're getting are we going to have to get this vaccine every year? And then Stephanie Seworth has this question about the current vaccine distribution. Stephanie, go ahead.
Hi, my question is, I'm sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
As there are more vaccines that are coming online and are going to be available, are there considerations that we should think about if and when we have a choice in which vaccine we receive?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And to me, the challenge now is supply, 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 supply. So I would love to be in the situation where we're making choices about vaccine. Again, I'll use my influenza vaccine example for that. Influenza, we have multiple different vaccines. We do have choices about what vaccines we receive. Some work better in people over age 65, the high dose vaccines, the adjuvanted vaccines. You know, for children, we can have them get the nasal spray vaccine, or we can have them get a shot. And that's really based on preference. You know, would you rather have tingling in your nose and a little nasal congestion, or would you rather have a needle in your arm? So we certainly may get there with coronavirus vaccines. Again, so far, you know, we really only have definitive data on the mRNA vaccines. They appear to work equally well across subpopulations, among older, among minorities. They've looked at obesity, they've looked at chronic disease, very high efficacy. So from what we've seen so far, I don't think we will be making decisions on age or risk condition, but we won't know that until we see some of these vaccines. Now, another factor here will be the storage and distribution conditions of the vaccine. People have heard the Pfizer vaccine needs to be in a -70 to -80 degree freezer. And for distribution, the minimum order is rather high. It's, you know, almost 1,000 doses. So, you know, this isn't an easy vaccine to give in the middle of nowhere. We at CVD work in rural Africa, and we're giving vaccines, you know, under a tree. The Pfizer vaccine isn't going to work in that situation. The Pfizer vaccine isn't going to work particularly well in the rural US. And so, you know, the Pfizer vaccine will likely go to large medical centers and healthcare institutions and be distributed for healthcare workers. And vaccines that are more stable at refrigerator temperature, for example, may be distributed more through pharmacies or in rural areas. So I think there are a number of factors that we might use. In terms of do we need vaccine every year, it's too soon to say. I will say that the first phase 1 trial started in March. CVD investigators were part of a team that just published the 4-month immunogenicity data. So how long does the immune response last? In the New England Journal of Medicine last week, it looks pretty good at 4 months. You know, we think it's likely, if you just look at the trajectory, it's going to look good at 6 months. We'll probably start boosting people in those early trials at about a year, you know, just to see how it looks. So it's really too soon to say right now if you will need another dose of vaccine in the long term.
Okay. We also have questions in the chat about people with food allergies, pregnant women, those that are below 16 years of age, and, you know, elderly who were not part of that trial. Do you have concerns about those groups?
Yeah, I think today at the FDA meeting, you know, we would all really like to hear more, and I'm not privy to any confidential or additional information than what most of us have read in the papers about the 2 cases, or 2 or 3. In one instance, I heard someone say 4. So, you know, it almost borders on rumor at this point. I'm hoping they will discuss that. I'm sure they will discuss that at the FDA meeting today with these more serious allergic reactions. I think that's something we have to pay attention to. And, you know, if people with very severe allergies should get vaccines, again, I think we're going to have to pay attention to this and see how it pans out. I've already talked a little bit about children. Older people were included in all of these trials. Again, you know, the numbers get limited when you get above 75, but there actually were enough people over the age of 75 to show show efficacy. We know they're immunogenic, so we're really very hopeful about how these vaccines will work in older people. In terms of pregnant women, they haven't been tested in pregnant women. Again, there's very, very active planning right now to move quickly into testing in pregnant women. This is likely, paying attention to the CDC hearings, to be what's called shared clinical decision making, a conversation between a pregnant woman and her physician. We do know that pregnancies, of course, occurred when you have trials of 30 to 40,000 people, and women of childbearing age are going to have pregnancies occur. They did occur, but only, 10 pregnancies perhaps in each trial. So not enough to say anything definitively, but certainly nothing of concern either in the inadvertent pregnancies.
All right. Well, we're not all going to get it at once. So I'm going to bring Terry Sharp in with the big question about how we figure this out. Terry, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize I was going to be called upon. My question
I
is.
messaged you. I'm sorry. Yeah.
That's
Go
okay.
ahead.
Who is going to be making the decision of the most vulnerable? Who will this get rolled out to first? Who's going to make that decision?
Yeah, Terry, really good question. So the government owns this vaccine, which is a good thing. You and me and everybody on this call that pays taxes help to finance these vaccines. And so, the government advisory bodies will put out recommendation, and that's the CDC and its independent advisory committee on immunization practices, who have already worked very hard and have already publicly released a likely priority list. And then states will be allocated vaccine. That vaccine will come from the CDC. And then within those parameters, each state will decide, who within the category 1 priority group might be moved ahead or behind, depending on your population mix in that state and depending on how many vaccines you get. So we know that in almost every allocation, we've seen that people who work in healthcare settings are at the top of the list. And that's obviously for a variety of reasons. We want to protect our patients. So similar to why we take influenza vaccine, we want to keep people on the job. I don't have to tell anyone here that the hospitals are filling up, the ICUs are filling up. Even if a healthcare worker doesn't have COVID, if they're exposed to COVID, they have to quarantine and stay out of society. And so we can have critical healthcare shortages, which we have seen in many places. And then, our healthcare workers stepping forward and taking this vaccine and understanding as much as they can about this vaccine are going to be ambassadors for the public getting this vaccine. Beyond that, we're looking at long-term care facilities. We know that that people, for example, over the age of 80 have about 800 times the risk of dying from COVID as a younger person, and most deaths have occurred in older Americans. These long-term care facilities have just been decimated. And from there, we'll look at critical workers, people who are not able to work from home, people who have to go to work every day and do jobs that help all of us. We'll look at older Americans who aren't in long-term care facilities and other risk groups.
And so for the group, the audience, there is a fairly well-developed process that's being led by the Unified Command for UMMS, UMMC, and UMB to look at how we roll this out in this medical institution, particularly around frontline workers, how it'll be administered, et cetera. There's a lot of work yet to be done on that. Alex, I'm wondering if you've got any questions about the underserved community, trust in the community about the vaccine.
Well, I can look for that specifically. In the meantime, would you mind if I want to bring in Patrick Beauvois? You know him, of course. Well, I look for that question because he was part of the Pfizer trial and has some other questions, and I think it might be interesting. Patrick, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, go ahead, please. I'll look for that question.
Hi, thank you for having me. Yes, I was a participant in the Pfizer vaccine, and as you know, I had low-grade fever 24 hours post and nothing much else, and I was fine after that. But I have a question, a broader question. We've learned a really hard lesson with this coronavirus, and we had some preview with SARS and SARS-1 and MERS. Are there efforts going on to determine the full breadth of coronaviruses in the environment and in animals? And should we prepare for SARS-CoV-3?
Yeah, I think the simple answer to that is absolutely. Again, this is the pandemic of our generation, the worst pandemic in the last 100 years. We've had 3 emergences of these exotic coronaviruses in the last 2 decades. I don't think any of us should be assured that it's not going to happen again. In fact, I think we should absolutely expect it to happen again. I talked about the basic science that went into the antigen optimization and the understanding of the S protein. There's been a dearth of investment in the basic science of coronaviruses. I think we will see that change. We've already heard people at NIH talking about pan-coronavirus vaccines. So I do hope that from the science perspective, we get serious about learning more about coronaviruses, understanding coronaviruses, and again, assuming that this will happen again and be prepared for it. And thank you for being in our trial. We appreciate it.
Well, no one has specifically asked about acceptance, vaccine acceptance, but that's obviously clearly an issue that you've got to deal with, and you deal with in getting the test populations, because if you can't test against various populations, you won't know whether it's going to be safe. What was it like? What were the obstacles, or what kind of feedback did you get from people? We have a very diverse community here in Baltimore. What was it like getting that complete set of all types of people to really test this vaccine?
Yeah, so the emphasis on diversity really started at the top in this effort. Moncef Slaoui, who's the appointed head of Operation Warp Speed, Tony Fauci has been all over the news talking about how important it was both for us to understand how the vaccine works in these populations and to gain their confidence in this vaccine. And so we had for all of these trials, we hope to have the trial population reflect the U.S. general population. And we had just over 30% minorities. We wanted to be sure to have, 20 to 40% older people. We needed to understand how this vaccine would work in those people who were being most affected by it. Now, I can't take credit for the efforts here. I can tell you they were enormous efforts led by Dr. Karen Kotloff, Dr. Matt Lawrence, Dr. Monica MacArthur, Dr. Millie Tapia, among others. Included outreach to both the Hispanic and the African American populations. Dr. Jarrell can probably comment as well through a variety of mechanisms, certainly reaching out to trusted leaders in those populations, for having a formal partnership with CASA, which is a large Hispanic not-for-profit that serves all of Maryland, but has a large location in Prince George's County, really blocks from where I grew up and not far from the University of Maryland. Millie Tapia has been on Spanish-speaking TV and news programs. Dr. Wroblewski was here, and his wife, and they were participants in our trial. They allowed us to photograph them. They were interviewed. There were wonderful stories in the newspapers. So again, I think it's been a variety of efforts. And I would also say that, trust and speed work at odds. And so this would have been impossible without, again, Dr. Jarrell and other efforts at the UMB over years that have led our community to trust us. No matter how hard you work, you can't gain that trust overnight. You can't gain that trust at the speed that we had to enroll for these vaccines. So again, it's working with the community on a day-to-day basis that when a crisis comes, allows you to mobilize those relationships that have been built. And really, Dr. Jarrell, I mean, you should speak on this more than me in our particular community.
Well, I just think that we've got a lot of work to do because with these vaccines coming out, we've got these lists of priorities, and we need to make sure that the minority population not only has got a priority here, but that we have a mechanism to, one, give them trust, and two, make it easy for them to get this vaccine so that they can benefit from it. Because I can tell you, I want the vaccine when it comes out. It's going to protect me, and I hope we can convince all of our neighbors about the veracity of that. Alex, you had one question that was related to this, didn't you?
Sure, we have one, and this woman wants to be anonymous, wants to remain anonymous. The question is, and she heard that someone who had the placebo in a study died, and wondered how. And these are the kinds of information that people hear, and it may be true, and I'm not doubting the woman who's asking the question. It may not be true sometimes. You hear different things, but when you hear something like that, that makes it even tougher to trust. And she writes, that she knows someone who died and got a placebo. I don't know how they know they got the placebo. How does that happen if you're just taking a fake drug?
Well, I mean, people die all the time of any number of causes. What we do know is a person in the placebo group died of COVID-19. So that had nothing to do with the saline injection. What it had to do with is they were unfortunate enough to get the placebo and not the vaccine. So when they were exposed to COVID, they got COVID, became very ill, and died from COVID. Which again is exactly why we're giving the vaccine, to keep people from dying from COVID.
Perhaps that's what she meant. I keep getting people questioning in chat, and they're reminding me they really want an answer to this, and that is, what about people who've had COVID, and especially if they were asymptomatic, or maybe their body didn't exhibit a strong response? Do they still need to get this vaccine or some vaccine when it's available?
Absolutely. And those people were included in the trial. There aren't as many of them, of course, because even if the attack rate at the moment is 3% or 4% in the US, that means the vast majority of us haven't had it, but they were included in the trials. We don't know what kind of immunity you get from natural infection. We are seeing studies that suggest the more severe your disease is, the better immunity you have, which means all of these people walking around with asymptomatic or mild infection just may not have good immunity. So yes, the vaccine will be recommended for everyone, even if you have, or think you have, or know you have already had COVID.
So we're about out of time, but one sort of final thing, Kathy. So CVD has trials. You have trials perhaps coming up in additional COVID vaccine trials. You also do influenza trials and other trials. How do people gain access to being considered for your trials? And what's been the demand for participating in trials?
Yeah, so the easy way is to go to it's www.cvdtrials.org, and that will have the COVID trials, and that will have all the other trials. For those of you here on campus, you can just search our website and you'll find your way there. As with everybody else, we haven't been doing as many other trials. We will continue them later, but we certainly don't want to put people at risk from leaving their homes and coming into the healthcare center, and we've put high value on that priority. But we have had an absolutely wonderful response from the community. You know, I always say these trial volunteers here and throughout the U.S. have been the real heroes. We never would be where we are with these vaccines if we hadn't had so many people selflessly step forward and volunteer, including you, Dr. Jarrell. So thank you.
Well, thank you. This is my fifth vaccine trial, and I think it's really important to do. And I just want to urge those of you in the community listening in, it is important to participate. We do need various populations to be in this. I volunteered because I was the young and healthy group, but they let me in anyhow. But I would urge you all to remember it's really important to participate. This is a fundamental part of our health sciences campus, clinical research. And so, Dr. Neuzil, I want to thank you for a most exciting and enlightening hour. I'm sorry you have to do this every day, but I'm pleased that you did it with us today. And I look forward to a further update from you sometime in maybe January or February when you know a lot more than we all know now. So I want to thank you again. Wonderful occasion. And for those in the audience, thank you for attending. Until next time.
Thank you. Good questions. Bye.
Bye.